Who are our stakeholders? What do they do? What are their responsibilities, their roles, their relationships? There can be an awful lot of them, a lot more than we think, and it's also useful to remember that a stakeholder is anyone who can wield a sharp-pointed stake in our direction. So we use a tool called the HoloMap to map the stakeholders. A set of different views: the service itself, the internals, its transactions, the direct interactions, and the indirect interactions. This helps us to place the stakeholders, which clarifies what they do, where they are, what their relationship is with them, and their relationships with each other. So typically we'll start with the organisation as the service itself, which doesn't have any stakeholders because it's the thing that stakeholders have relationships with. We then map the stakeholders in the organisation's internal services, the IT and more, and we then map 3 layers outward from the organisation. The first is the enterprise of transaction, with suppliers, the whole supply chain, the transaction web with customers and the rest. Then we look at the market. Who are our stakeholders within the market, such as recruiters and so on, and direct interactions. And finally we look at the indirect interactions with people who we don't interact generally with as such, but they can have huge impacts on us. Now, so far this has been kind of abstract, so kind of yawn, so let's make it come alive. Let's add the human dimension with some simple mini figures. We'll start off with the organisation as a whole, the kind of us, represented here by a manager sitting in that position of the organisation. If we're somewhere down in IT, with that dreaded relationship between IT and the business, we might think that the business is the only stakeholder that matters. But actually we're going to need to have a whole lot of other services that we relate with who might also be stakeholders. There's facilities, there's accounts, there's production, there's planning, there's engineering, all in addition to what we've seen with just the IT. And remember, these may be under our direction, but they're never truly under our control. That distinction is important. Next we look at the immediate supply chain, the obvious ones like supplier and customer. But we actually need to think much more broadly about not just the supplier, but the supplier's supplier, not just the customer, but the customer's customer, and also any prospects, supplier prospects and customer prospects. We now need to look at the stakeholders in the broader market. There are our competitors, of course, everyone thinks about those, but there's also the regulators, there's recruiters, there's journalists, there's analysts, there's trainers, there's many others. All of these, they don't interact with us on the main supply chain, but they do have direct interactions with us. Now beyond that, there's a kind of shared story. These are people who interact only indirectly at times, but can have huge impacts on us. Things like the infrastructure and other broad scope services that keep our business going. There's the families in the community, the families of our employees, the families of our customers, of everyone else. There's government, there's politics, there's what's happening in other countries than the ones we're doing, that can change the whole story on us. There's the big picture, the observers of the whole story, people who are keeping track of how well we keep our promises. There are the anti-clients, the people who believe we've already broken our promises and who will work very hard to prevent us keeping our business. And there are hackers and other criminals who just want to make money or make destruction for the sake of it. These are indirect stakeholders, but we need to be aware of them because their stakes can be very sharp. So when we look at the whole of the enterprise, the whole space, there are a lot of interactions, a lot of stakeholders. So we started with the organisation as service. We took the classic IT-centric view. We expanded it out to internal services, IT and more. We looked at the immediate and direct transactions and the whole transaction web. We then looked at stakeholders in the market, the direct interactions that we have. And they added the shared story stakeholders, the indirect interaction. So when we start looking at this in terms of this, we'd started without any stakeholders, just ourselves. But we need to include all of the internal services who might be stakeholders. We need to add the internal plus the transaction stakeholders. We need to add the direct interaction, the market stakeholders from the market and the market space. And we need to add those from the overall story, the whole enterprise stakeholders. Internal, transaction, direct interaction, indirect interaction. So we use the HoloMap to map these stakeholders for the organisation as a whole. Or we can use it in another way, just for any service, by placing that one service as the centre and mapping outward from there. So we use the HoloMap to help make sense of stakeholders, their roles, their relationships, their responsibilities, and their interactions with us. That's what the HoloMap helps us to do. Thanks for watching. Do look at the YouTube description for links to further detail. And don't forget to subscribe for other videos, and also to support us on Patreon to help us produce these videos and the tools themselves.